I was at a Universal Concept store yesterday watching a guy get incredibly animated over a row of identical charcoal gray tunics. There were no men's or women's sections, just a single rack labeled the human line. He was practically vibrating with excitement, telling me how clean it felt to shop in a space without the aggression of gender. He kept saying it gave him a profound sense of relief, as if he was, finally being allowed to just exist without the burden of a category. His face had this almost giddy, self-congratulatory glow, as if he'd personally solved the 1,000 years of social conflict by purchasing a shapeless sweater. He didn't offer any practical arguments about fit or fabric. Instead, he showed me some digital blueprints on his tablet, the new 2026 neutrality zones being built in the city. "Look at the symmetry," he whispered. "No labels, no roles, just pure space." To him, these sterile, interchangeable non-places were the ultimate proof that humanity was finally ascending. He didn't seem to care that the designs looked more like high-end administrative clinics than living environments. To him, the erasure of difference was the ironclad proof of progress. But then, the tone shifted. Someone nearby mentioned a new local proposal to prioritize traditional family-oriented spaces in the new district. Just that one sentence, and the guy who'd been so serene just moments before, his expression completely curdled. He went from universal inclusivity to furious condemnation in a heartbeat. He started ranting about how families were just legacy code and biological traps that needed to be dismantled. That sudden snap from an airy celebration of neutrality to a cold, visceral hatred for the basic structures of human life was jarring. It made me realize that his excitement wasn't about liberation at all. It was about a deep-seated desire to dissolve every anchor that makes us human. What he called progress looked a lot more like civilizational entropy, the sound of a society choosing to disappear into its own sterile beige void.
That is a perfect illustration of the central tension we're going to explore. That snap, that jarring clash you saw between this abstract ideal of, universal inclusion and the immediate visceral condemnation of these foundational human structures. Well, that's the perfect entry point for this deep dive.
It really felt like two different people in one body.
And the material we've looked at suggests that this systematic erasure you witnessed, whether it's gender markers in a store or gender designs in architecture, it's far more than just an aesthetic choice. It's not just a cultural evolution.
You're saying it's a symptom.
It's a clinical symptom of a much deeper structural societal decline.
So, okay, we're treating this pervasive quest for neutrality, this whole architectural and consumerist drive to flatten all difference. We're not seeing it as an advancement, but maybe as a kind of social pathology.
Exactly, a condition that
So the mission for this deep dive is to really get into that tension between, liberation on one hand and dissolution on the other.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And to do that, the framework for our deep dive is really structured around three interlocking lenses.
Okay.
First, we have to look at the sociological breakdown. We'll examine what happens when these organic structures of society start to dissolve, and we'll use functionalist theory for that.
The nuts and bolts of society.
The nuts and bolts.
No.
Second, we'll look at the cultural expression of that exhaustion. So things like aesthetic nihilism and decadence, what does it look like?
So the feeling in the air.
Right. And then finally, the power dynamics. The political dimension. We'll assess how a rising managerial class might use administrative control to actually, facilitate this very atomization. We're looking for the underlying architecture of entropy.
Okay, so if the goal of these neutrality zones and the human line is to create a kind of universal, interchangeable humanity, we probably have to start by understanding why specialization and difference were ever considered necessary in the first place. And that takes us right back to the core functionalist perspective on society.
It does. Functionalism begins with this macro view, this big picture idea. It argues that society is a complex system, almost like a body, where all the parts have to work together to promote solidarity and stability.
So every institution, like the government, education, the economy, they all have a job to do.
They all have a specific function. And bedrock institutions, especially the family, are required to perform these essential functions just for society to keep going, for societal maintenance.
And the functionalist argument is that if these functions stop being performed, or if the structure that's supposed to perform them changes too fast,
the stability of the entire social system is fundamentally threatened. It's a very direct cause and effect.
Okay. So when sociologists in the mid-20th century were looking at the family through this lens, they were trying to pin down universal functions, things that held true everywhere, across all cultures.
That's right.
And the research really points us straight to George Murdoch. In 1949, he came out and asserted that the nuclear family performs 4 functions that are basically indispensable. So what are those 4 pillars, and why did he think they were so universal?
Well, Murdoch's assertion of universality came from this massive cross-cultural study he did. He looked at 250 different societies, and his conclusion was that in every single one, some form of the nuclear family unit, a man, a woman, and their children, was required to perform these vital tasks.
He saw it as the base model.
As the standard model, yes, that we must first measure everything against. And the 4 universal residual functions he identified were sexual regulation, reproduction, socialization, and meeting economic needs.
Okay, let's detail those. Let's start with the sexual function. Now, in the sources, the functionalist perspective seems to stress that this isn't so much about morality, it's more about social stability.
Absolutely. That's a critical distinction. For Murdoch, the family was essential for regulating sexual relations. It wasn't just about limiting sex for its own sake. It was about ensuring that the sex drive, which can be a really potent, really disruptive social force, was satisfied within a controlled, socially acceptable context.
Which for him was monogamous heterosexual marriage.
Primarily, yes. And the key insight there is that this control, this channeling, actively prevents destructive sexual jealousy. It prevents rivalry that would just disrupt the broader social order and all the cooperative work that's necessary for a society to survive.
So it's a practical consideration. It's about stability.
It's all about stability. It provides that stability through institutionalized channeling.
Okay. And that function leads directly into the second pillar, which is reproduction. That one seems pretty straightforward.
It is. It's about the biological survival of society itself, just making sure the population replenishes from one generation to the next.
And the third is socialization. This is where the family acts as the primary teacher.
Right. The primary agent? Yes. It's where children are taught the cultural norms, the values, the language, everything that makes them functional members of their society. It's the first and most important school.
And the fourth pillar, economic needs, seems to tie directly back into the idea of structural roles.
It does. The family unit, especially the nuclear model Murdoch was focused on, acts as a primary economic unit. It's a unit of both production and consumption. And for Murdoch, this function almost always necessitated a division of labor within that household.
A division based on gender?
Based on gender, which he viewed as simply the most efficient way to ensure the unit's economic survival.
Okay, this brings us to Talcott Parsons, who was writing a bit later about industrial America. He refined Murdoch's views, didn't he?
He did. Parsons' argument was that as society modernized, the state took over many of the family's old functions, things like education, healthcare, welfare.
Right, the state got bigger.
The state got bigger. But Parsons argued that the family, specifically the nuclear family, became more specialized. It held on to 2 core functions that no other institution could really perform effectively.
What were those 2?
He called them primary socialization and the stabilization of adult personalities. He saw modern society as demanding immense productivity from its adult members, often at a huge psychological cost. The family's new, specialized job was to buffer that stress.
Okay, so primary socialization, that's the real groundwork. The child learning basic cultural norms, attitudes, values. It's like setting the emotional template for the rest of their life.
It is the fundamental groundwork. And Parsons really stressed that this groundwork must include gender role socialization. In his model, for it to be done correctly, boys learn what he called the instrumental role, and girls learn the expressive role.
We'll get to those in a second, but first, that other function, the stabilization of adult personalities, this is the famous warm bath theory.
That's the one. The idea is that the family acts as a refuge, a literal warm bath, where adults, and he was mostly focused on the working man returning home, can shed the stresses and the competitive pressures of the industrial world.
So it's about providing emotional security, stress relief.
And interestingly, a place where adults can safely regress. They can play with their children, let go of their professional persona, and reduce that internal tension.
And for Parsons, this was vital, because if adult personalities weren't stabilized at home,
then the workplace itself would be destabilized. That would lead to lower productivity, social friction, and ultimately social disorder. The home and the workplace were a linked system.
Which brings us to the core of this whole differentiation issue, the instrumental expressive divide. Now, a modern listener, maybe even the guy in the store, would argue that blurring these roles is a good thing. It offers flexibility, individual freedom. Where did the functionalists argue that that flexibility actually destabilizes the whole structure?
Well, they argued that the division of labor was necessary for balance and for efficiency. The roles weren't seen as one being better than the other. They were seen as complementary. They fit together.
So define the instrumental role.
The instrumental role, which they typically associated with the male, was external facing. It was about securing financial support, setting long-term goals, and basically connecting the family unit to the wider society. It was the practical execution of tasks.
The doing role.
The doing role.
Yeah.
And the expressive role, typically associated with the female, was internal facing. It was about providing emotional support, doing the internal family work, caregiving, and maintaining harmony within the unit. The psychological maintenance, if you will.
So the stability of the family, and by extension society, relies on two different people being specialized in two different complementary tasks.
Yes.
So if you blur the roles, or if one of them isn't being performed, the whole family is thrown out of functional balance.
That's the argument, exactly. Murdoch specifically warned about this. He said, if family members habitually move outside these defined roles, say, if a father takes on the primary expressive childcare role, then the mother must successfully take on the instrumental wage-earning role to maintain that essential balance.
It has to be recalibrated.
It must be recalibrated. And a failure to do that means the family is at risk of collapse. Not because of any moral failing, but because of internal role confusion and a simple failure to meet those societal maintenance functions.
So the erosion of gender differentiation is seen through this lens as an erosion of functional necessity.
Precisely.
This idea of the functional necessity of differentiated complementary labor, it seems to lead us directly to Emile Durkheim, who took this argument from just the family unit and applied it to the whole of society with his concepts of social solidarity.
Durkheim's work is absolutely crucial here, especially his book, The Division of Labor and Society. He was obsessed with the question of how societies cohere, what holds them together, and he outlined two fundamental forms of this social glue.
The first one is mechanical solidarity,
Right.
which sounds exactly like the environment the man in the charcoal gray tunic store was celebrating.
It is cohesion through sameness. Think of small, pre-industrial societies where pretty much everyone performs the same social functions. They're all farmers or hunters, and they all share virtually identical beliefs.
A strong collective conscience.
A very strong collective conscience, as he called it. They stick together because they are identical, like atoms in a rock. And any deviation from that sameness is immediately and harshly repressed.
So that desire for interchangeable, universal human units that we see today is, in a way, a retreat back to this more primitive form of solidarity.
It's an attempt to go back, yes. But complex industrial societies like ours, they rely on the second form, organic solidarity.
Cohesion through difference.
Cohesion through difference and critically interdependence. It's like the specialized organs in a body. In a modern society, the division of labor is so complex that no single person can meet all their own needs. The farmer relies on the builder, who relies on the accountant, who in turn relies on the farmer.
And it's this mutual dependence, this need for complementary roles that forms the essential glue of a modern complex society.
Exactly.
And this seems to be the critical finding connecting everything back to our sources. The specialized complementary labor that was historically defined by gender, those instrumental and expressive roles, that forms the bedrock of organic solidarity within the most fundamental unit of society, which is the family.
That's the structural view. So the drive toward gender neutrality in this framework is a deeply counterintuitive attempt to impose mechanical solidarity, that flattening of difference onto a society that fundamentally requires organic solidarity to function.
You eliminate the need for specialized complementary interdependence.
And in doing so, you weaken the social cohesion. You simplify the parts, but you risk collapsing the entire system.
You know, I recently came across a report that detailed the experiences of a retired carpenter named Elias. He was living in one of these new award-winning residential complexes in Northern Europe.
Right.
The whole place was designed as the epitome of gender-neutral living. No private spaces that hinted at status or role, just these modular, gray, interchangeable pods. And Elias, who spent his life building traditional homes, felt completely isolated. He said he felt like a ghost in a filing cabinet.
Oh.
And he specifically mentioned the semantic shift. The school forms he had to fill out for his grandchild had replaced the word father with primary caregiver. And to him, that change stripped the blood and bone out of the relationship. He was feeling that social atomization that happens when you scrub away difference.
Elias's story is the perfect lived-in reality of the semantic deconstruction. When you replace a specialized, identity-laden term like father which carries all this weight, this history, a specific complementary role with a purely functional administrative term like primary caregiver.
It's transactional.
It's completely transactional. You are signaling that the relationship is provisional. It's based only on the function being performed at that moment, not on any inherent stable identity.
And functionally, that has to raise what economists would call the transaction costs of maintaining society. If every individual unit is interchangeable and every spiralized role is just provisional, the amount of effort required to maintain cohesion, that social glue, just becomes too great.
It becomes prohibitive. We aimed for equality by making everyone interchangeable, but the result seems to be that individuals feel uniquely, profoundly alone. The system becomes less, not more, adhesive.
Okay, so if functionalism identifies the structural failure, the breakdown of the machine, our next lens has to examine the cultural expression of this. How does it feel? What does it look like?
Exactly. So now we shift to the concept of decadence, this idea of a perceived decay of standards and the aesthetic expression of a society that is, frankly, exhausted.
Decadence as a cultural movement really got going in the late 19th century, and it was characterized by this obsession with egocentricity, the artificial, the bizarre, all these exotic sensations. The word itself means decay or decline.
And it always implies that it's a prelude to some kind of societal destruction. There's a sense of weariness that paradoxically fuels this frantic consumption.
That paradox is really interesting. The historian Jacques Barzun, he provided a more clinical definition that goes beyond just a moral critique.
Yes, his definition is incredibly useful. He defined decadent eras as times when, and I'm quoting loosely here, the forms of art as of life seem exhausted. The stages of development have been run through. Institutions function manfully.
So it's a state where a society has achieved this immense material prosperity and complexity, but it feels intellectually and culturally just worn out. It's unable to create genuinely new or coherent forms.
It just recycles and rehashes old forms, but without the original spirit.
And our sources cite some very modern symptoms that seem to track this specific kind of systemic exhaustion, starting around the late 1960s. This suggests it's far beyond just an architectural style.
Oh, absolutely. Some documentary analysis points to these profound symptoms that show a society basically consuming itself. Things like increasing suicide rates, widespread dependence on antidepressants, the breakdown of the traditional family, a loss of faith, or any shared transcendental belief.
And critically, this is paired with what's called treadmill consumption.
Right, where money becomes the sole benchmark for value. It drives this perpetual, unsatisfying cycle of acquisition because the genuine sources of social and cultural fulfillment have just evaporated. You buy things to fill a void that can't be filled with things.
This cultural and psychological exhaustion, it seems to manifest directly in the art and architecture of these neutrality zones, which is an expression of aesthetic nihilism.
Yes. If the old values are seen as meaningless, which is an idea that thinkers like Nietzsche and Schopenhauer really explored, then creators begin to renounce traditional concepts like beauty, order, and meaning. They embrace the void.
You can trace this in our history, can't you?
You can. A classic example is Kazimir Malevich's Black Square from 1915. It was the ultimate expression of his suprematist movement. It was a complete and total abandonment of representational art. He was embracing what he called the white emptiness of a liberated nothing.
Just a black square on a white background.
That's it. Or you can go back even further to Degas' painting L'Absinthe. It depicts these two forlorn, isolated figures in a Parisian cafe. At the time, critics were shocked. They saw it as a sign of this general mood of despair and ambiguity, a real cultural dissent. These works signal that the common language of beauty and shared meaning has been exhausted.
And the sterile, gray, undecorated architecture that we see in the neutrality zones, it just applies this nihilism to our physical, lived-in space. It is, as the source material defines it, an architecture of deracination.
Deracination, uprooting. It deliberately suppresses the biological, the historical, and the cultural dimensions of human experience.
It creates physical spaces that are purely functional and transient.
And that's where the anthropologist Marc Augier's term non-places comes in.
Right.
These are zones like airports, highways, corporate lobbies, or those charcoal gray concept stores you mentioned. There are spaces where history, relationships, and identity are perpetually suspended. You are reduced to a user, not a resident.
Which is exactly the environmental conditioning you would need to create that atomized individual that Durkheim was so worried about.
It's the perfect training ground.
Speaking of those stores, I learned about a designer, Clara, who worked for a high-end lifestyle brand. Her entire job was to curate retail spaces under this banner of aesthetic nihilism. Everything was strictly non-binary and, as she put it, vibeless.
Vibeless, that's a great term for it.
And she shared this observation that her wealthy clients, surrounded by all this expensive beige emptiness, they just looked utterly lost. And she realized that removing the traditional anchors of style and identity didn't stop consumerism at all. It just made it more frantic and hollow.
Clara's insight is absolutely vital. It explains the psychological mechanism that connects this idea of decadence with modern consumption. The individual is culturally exhausted, but they still ravenously indulge in the products of the globalized age because they're trying to fill that void.
And the consumption is frantic because the basic sociological structures that used to provide identity and meaning have been dissolved.
Exactly. There's nothing else to hold on to.
This psychological need to fill the void, it often translates into holding what our sources call luxury beliefs.
Right. A luxury belief is a conviction, and it's often championed by the affluent professional managerial class. It's a belief that confers status on the person holding it. It signals their moral superiority and enlightenment. But it disproportionately imposes serious costs upon less privileged groups. So, for example, the elite endorsement of dissolving fixed identities and traditional family norms. That functions as high social capital for them. It makes them look progressive.
But those costs are heavily borne by working-class communities, where stable, differentiated family structures and clear divisions of labor are. Well, they're not optional. They're crucial for economic survival and functional stability.
Exactly. The luxury belief costs nothing to the wealthy individual who can afford alternative support networks like nannies and therapists, but it costs the working class their social cohesion.
And psychologically, this wholesale rejection of fixed labels, this refusal to be anchored in an environment where stable institutions have vanished, our sources suggest it can be interpreted as a form of defensive narcissism.
That's a strong term, but it's a useful one. It's a strategy to maintain maximum personal freedom by avoiding commitment and accountability. If there are no fixed categories, no binding social contracts, and every relationship is just provisional,
the individual gains freedom from responsibility,
at the immense cost of profound social isolation and rootlessness.
So we've tracked the structural decline and the cultural exhaustion, but now we have to ask the political question. Who is running this architecture of entropy? I mean, who benefits from this wide-scale atomization?
And that takes us to our third lens, the political framework of the managerial state.
This concept was developed by thinkers like James Burnham, Paul Gottfried, and maybe most famously, Christopher Lasch.
Yes. It posits that modern Western societies are governed by a powerful, ongoing regime, the managerial state, that sustains itself regardless of which political party is nominally in power. And this regime is run by what they call a cognitive elite.
Lawyers, academics, journalists, systems analysts.
Of people who traffic in information and specialized expertise. Their power comes from their credentials and their control of complex systems.
And Lasch argued that this new elite, because they're focused on global systems and social mobility, has essentially removed themselves from the common life of their local communities.
They have. They use private services. They live in insulated neighborhoods. They are fundamentally disconnected from the shared daily participation that democracy, historically, has always relied upon.
Their priority is maintaining their own power through what's called the reign of specialized expertise.
Which is inherently anti-democratic, in a sense. It stands in opposition to a democracy that's grounded in the shared life and practical wisdom of ordinary working people.
And crucially, the managerial state has evolved over the last century. It started out primarily concerned with material welfare, managing big economic systems, infrastructure, social safety nets.
But it's transitioned into something else.
Yes.
It's now often called the therapeutic state.
Yeah.
And this is where the power dynamic shifts from managing goods and services to managing minds and attitudes.
Exactly. The therapeutic state moves beyond just material management. It is now primarily concerned with the installation of correct mental and psychological attitudes.
It uses specialized skills therapy, psychological intervention, administrative compliance to rationalize its own dominance. Right. It seeks to cure social pathologies, things like racism and sexism, as defined by the elite. And it enforces this re-education through a kind of soft totalitarian control over citizens who hold incorrect or outdated beliefs.
There's a fascinating comparison in the source material between the old elite and this new elite. Traditional elites, landowners, industrialists, their power was anchored in things you could touch. Inherited property, stable institutions like the family.
And so they were often invested in maintaining those external structures. They needed them.
Whereas the managerial elite's power is wholly dependent on the institutions they themselves control and the specialized skills they possess.
Which means they have a vested interest in extending those institutions and making all of society entirely dependent on their technical expertise.
And consequently, they are inherently hostile to any institution that provides an alternate organizing principle and does not require their specialized skill set.
Chief among them, the traditional family and any fixed identities that are rooted in biological reality.
So this is where corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI initiatives and the systematic corporate embrace of gender neutrality become crucial. They can function as perhaps cynical tools for administrative manipulation rather than purely altruistic forms of liberation.
The sources identify three primary managerial objectives that are served by this push for neutrality. First, it eliminates natural organizing principles. By dissolving fixed organic categories like male and female social groups. You remove potential centers of authority or shared identity that might exist outside of, and therefore challenge, institutional control.
Okay, and the second?
It reduces individuals to perfectly interchangeable units within bureaucratic systems. This makes them much easier to manage, to track, to reallocate, and ultimately to replace. They become human resources in the most literal sense.
And third, it substitutes substantive equality, which means equal opportunity, a measurable material goal with symbolic equality.
Yes. The focus shifts to equal representation and, more critically, the policing of attitudes and language. All the energy shifts from solving material inequality to enforcing psychological compliance.
And this creates the managerial state's ideal subject.
It does. An atomized individual, detached from communal life, and emotionally dependent on the corporate or state structure for their identity, for their validation, and for therapeutic instruction, they become the perfect, fluid consumer and employee.
There's a really powerful anecdote about a man named Marcus, a mid-level HR executive at a massive tech firm. He was tasked with implementing a new language and inclusion protocol. And this protocol effectively mandated the erasure of all biological markers in corporate communication. At first, he genuinely felt he was pioneering progress. But over time, he started to see the internal costs.
What did he see?
By erasing these fundamental biological anchors and reducing employees to, in his words, units of productivity, he saw that management found it much easier to move people around the globe like chess pieces. He realized the DEI ideologies, which he believed were intended to protect, were actually functioning as a tool for administrative manipulation.
That's a huge realization.
And he observed that employees became more depressed, more disconnected from their own families, and increasingly reliant on their corporate identity, the very institution that was demanding their rootlessness.
That realization that these noble-sounding goals can be leveraged for administrative manipulation, that is the essence of this system. Marcus's experience perfectly illustrates a concept that Samuel T. Francis termed anarcho-tyranny.
Anarcho-tyranny. That is a stark and deeply unsettling concept. If we unpack it, how does the system actually function in practice?
Well, it describes a state that is simultaneously unable or unwilling to control ordinary disruptive crime, social breakdown, and chaos. That's the anarchy component. It's the decay of civil society.
But at the same time,
the state focuses tyrannical control on its law-abiding, productive citizens through excessive administrative decrees, therapeutic interventions, and this kind of soft totalitarianism.
So the state neglects its most basic function, which is protecting citizens from violent crime or securing its borders. And that allows chaos to fester.
And that chaos, paradoxically, increases the anxiety and dependence of the population on the managerial system for some form of security, however ineffective it may be.
Meanwhile, the most productive segment of the population is relentlessly micromanaged about their speech, their thoughts, their compliance with abstract behavioral protocols.
It creates what Francis called a state of law without order. The managerial elite is fundamentally interested in total behavioral control over the segment of society that produces wealth and pays taxes, while the chaotic elements are often allowed to rage on.
Why? What's the function of that?
Because it prevents the emergence of organic, self-regulating communities that don't rely on the specialized expertise of the government. The constant busybodying about gender pronouns and outdated beliefs is the tyranny. The visible, unmanaged chaos in public life is the anarchy, and both serve to necessitate the managerial class's continued dominance.
So this whole journey from functionalist necessity to a cultural void to political control, it brings us full circle, back to the man in the universal concept store.
It does.
That airy celebration of erasure, immediately followed by the furious condemnation of functional anchors, that's the sound of civilization entropy in action. It's the dissipation of creative energies, the hardening of organic life into sterile, bureaucratic rituals. It's the exhaustion of forms.
And this isn't without historical parallel. Scholars often point to the late Roman Empire, where the structural collapse was preceded by an inability to maintain its own fundamental distinctions.
They lost clarity about who was a citizen versus a non-citizen.
Exactly. Or where the human realm ended and the divine began. When a civilization loses the ability to define and enforce its basic internal categories, what it means to be a man, a woman, a family, or a citizen, it loses the ability to maintain itself.
And this erosion of internal distinctions, it manifests most immediately and maybe most dangerously through the corruption of language. It creates what the sources call reality lockout.
Reality lockout, that's a good way to put it. If we deliberately corrupt our language by confusing objective material categories like biological sex with subjective internal psychological states, we disconnect our entire social discourse from material conditions.
It makes it impossible to talk about reality.
It does. If we can't agree on the most fundamental definitions of reality, male versus female, then coherent social planning, problem solving, and the maintenance of a shared world become impossible. It's a fundamental loss of epistemological grounding that just feeds the entropy.
I can see the ultimate destination of this extreme enemy. If this trend continues, of making every person an interchangeable provisional unit, we arrive at that Durkheimian endpoint, a society of monads.
Perfectly free and perfectly isolated.
Perfectly free in their fluidity and perfectly isolated in their rootlessness. Communicating endlessly through screens, but never really connecting. Consuming everything the managerial state produces, but valuing nothing organically.
The gender-neutral future promises liberation, but it delivers dislocation. It offers fluidity, but it imposes rootlessness. It champions an abstract individuality, but it produces mass atomization.
The architecture of entropy is designed to simplify the human unit for administrative control.
But in doing so, it destroys the very complexity required for a flourishing civilization.
So against this immense structural, cultural, and political pressure, the reassertion of biological and social reality, it becomes something more than just a political position. It becomes a kind of civilizational imperative.
Maintaining that men are men and women are women, and that biological reality precedes and informs our social constructions. It becomes the final defense against the complete liquefaction of social reality. It's an act of what you might call epistemological hygiene, the conservation of fundamental shared truths, which is necessary to prevent the final dissipation of our organic bonds and the descent into total atomization.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the architecture of entropy, structural decline, aesthetic exhaustion, and the new challenges facing social cohesion.